So, we've made it to the final section in this Ansible chapter. In all the previous sections, the examples that we've been doing have been pretty theoretical, chosen entirely just to demonstrate this or that feature that we happen to be looking at the time. In this last section, it's going to get more complicated as we have a look at something we genuinely might want to do in a job in industry, deploying a fully configured Apache 2 web server with a website on it that we can actually browse to. For any of you that went to the basics chapter and had a look at the manually configuring Apache 2 site there, we're going to do exactly the same steps now, but this time the proper DevOps way, automating things using Ansible. To achieve this great ambition, we're going to need to add a couple more things to our Ansible repo by expanding out the role to include templates and handlers. Templates work in a similar way to files, whereby a file in the local repository is copied over to a location on the remote server. The difference between a template and a file is that the templates are created in the Ginger file format, which can contain variables, which are substituted in at the time of copying. Whereas something in the files folder is copied direct and unaltered, a template is populated with server-specific values that might vary from host to host. The other feature we're adding is a handler, which works exactly the same as a task, but it's just not run automatically. As you already know, when we run our Ansible playbook command, all the tasks that we have created get run in order, one after another. In contrast, a handler will only run if called by a task, which is very useful for things that need to happen only as the result of a change. Right, let's jump straight over to our Ubuntu VirtualBox machine and get trying these things out. As this is the last section in this chapter, I'm going to assume you all know how to spin up your servers by now that we'll be applying the config to, and you don't want to see that again. But if you do, you can see it in any of the other sections that we've been doing it in so far, so feel free to hop back now if you need to. Let's open a terminal here, and as always, cd to our Ansible repo, which if you don't already have it, is available at the Lernard GitHub page as always, the link to which is at the bottom of this player. I'll list the contents, and now I can copy our section 5 directory and call it section 6. Now we've done that, let's hop to Visual Studio Code and get stuck straight in by expanding out the web role and creating a directory called templates. As with all the directories and roles, you do want to copy these names exactly, as it's good standard practice, and also some of them really matter to Ansible. Inside the templates directory, I'm going to create a file called example.conf.j2. As I mentioned in the introduction, the .j2 file extension is short for Ginger2 and is the templating language used by Python. It's very popular and can be used other places than Ansible, so it's a really great one to get under our belts. The name example.conf is chosen at random, but the convention for anything you make as a template is to have what the final name of the file will be on the remote server suffixed by .j2. So in this case, the file on the server will end up being example.conf. So I've called my template example.conf.j2. Inside this example.conf file, I'm going to write some test data. This is an example of, followed by a variable that I'll just call example. Now, in the defaults main.yml, I'll add that variable name, example, and I'll give it the value of what a template can do. To cause this substitution to occur, and to copy the template to the right location, we're going to need a template task in the main.yml of tasks here. So I'll give it the name example template. Then the module name is template, and I just need the minimum 2 required fields for this example. The source, which is the location relative to the root of the repo, so in this case, templates/example.conf.j2, and then of course the destination, which is an absolute path on the remote server. I should say that in this case I don't actually have to write example.conf at the end if I don't want to, as Ansible will default to using whatever the file name of the template is, minus the J2 file ending, but I think it's usually better to be explicit when we can. OK, let's switch to the terminal and run this through. So, cd in to the section 6 folder we've created, and then, as always, our trusty Ansible-playbook -i hosts playbook_web.yml command. Great! We can see it's doing all the stuff it was doing in the last section, setting up web ports, installing Apache, and copying a demo file over. Plus now, at the bottom, it's also copied over the example template. If I go and copy the IP address for Web 1, we can SSH into the server and see exactly what the template has done. So, SSH, Ubuntu, and the IP address I've copied. There we go. You can see here when I list the files in the home directory that example.conf is there, and it's missing the J2 file extension, which has been removed when the template was converted. A quick look inside the file shows us fairly unsurprisingly that the variable has been replaced by its value, which I'm sure won't have come as a shock to you. Now we've seen the basic concept at work, let's have a crack at automating the full deployment of a working website on Apache then. Before we start, I've actually made this rather simple diagram to show what we're actually trying to achieve. We've got our Apache install, of course, and inside that we're going to define a virtual host using config at /etc/apache2/sitesavailable/www.learnardtest.com.conf, which, when enabled, will point us to a web root folder at /var/www/www.learnardtest.com, which itself contains an index.html web page, which will be what the user will see when they browse to our site. So, we're installing Apache, making the config, creating the web root, and copying over the index.html. I know I often lose track of exactly what it is I'm doing when I use tools like Ansible, so hopefully this will all make it a bit clearer. And just to reiterate, you can see all of this manually in the basics section if you haven't watched it already. The first thing I'm going to do is clean up a bit of the cruft that we've got lying around from the last section, so as not to muddy the waters as to what we're up to. Firstly, I'm going to switch back to defaults main.yml and change port to http_port. As in case any of you hadn't noticed, Ansible has been flagging a warning to me several times while I've been making these courses that the word port shouldn't really be used. I must admit to having been caught off guard by that, as port isn't actually listed as a reserved variable on the Ansible documentation, but let's just change this anyway to make the warning go away. We won't need this example variable anymore either, so let's delete that too. I'm going to do a find and replace here to just check where I've used the word port. And sure enough, it's only in the one place, so I can go and change that here to HTTP port, and then things should work fine. Okay, next I'm going to add a new variable into defaults that's going to come in handy in loads of places in this install. I'll call it domain, and I'll give it the value of www.learnardtest.com, which is the site name I've chosen to do this test with. As I mentioned in the introduction, alongside templates, the other concept I'm going to bring in now is handlers. A handler is like a task that is only run when we call it, as I mentioned. And in the case of our Apache setup, we're going to use this handler to restart the Apache service anytime a task makes a change that would require a restart of Apache for that change to be applied. We'll create a folder here in the role called handlers, another fixed name, and as always, a file in that folder called main.yml. We start with 3 dashes again, as it's YAML, and then I'm going to lay this out just like a task by giving it a name, in this case, Restart Apache. I'm going to use a new module here called service, which is used to provide all the same functionality as the old service command in Linux used to, i.e. starting, stopping, restarting, and all that jazz. The service we want to act on is Apache2, and we want to restart it, so I'm going to enforce a state of restarted. It would be fair at this point if you were thinking, where are you suddenly pulling all these modules from? There's been no talk of this service module up until now. And yes, it's true, and I'm afraid I'm going to use a few more new unannounced ones in this section too. But with Ansible, as I mentioned earlier in the chapter, it's usually safe to assume that whatever it is you want to do, there's a module for it or an easy way to achieve it. In the cases where there isn't, you can just use the command module and run bash commands to achieve those extras. But the range of available modules is just so comprehensive that it's always best to look for one first. As an example, in this case we wanted to restart Apache 2 whenever required. So googling Ansible restart Apache 2 will immediately give you examples on this service module straight away. DevOps is a really new field, and stuff changes incredibly rapidly, driven by giants like Google, AWS, Microsoft, and most of all the Linux community. This means that taking the mindset that whatever you want to do is probably out there somewhere, and making heavy use of search engines is the sign of a great DevOps engineer. So anyway, now we've written our handler, it will just sit there waiting for something to call it. And when something does call it, it will restart Apache 2. Now, if we're going to configure Apache, we're going to need a website for it to serve. I'm going to use the same simple HTML site I did in the example in the basics chapter. Let's create a files folder here, which as you probably remember is for containing any files we want to statically copy to a server without altering them. And in here I'll make a file called index.html, and I'm going to just cut and paste that simple HTML page into it that I made earlier. You don't even need to bother with HTML if you don't want. Feel free to just write hello world in here and it will serve just as well. We just need anything to identify that it is serving our custom domain name. You can see here on mine I've got Lernard test site as the title and this success message here that we'll hopefully be able to see once our config is done. Right, let's go over to tasks main.yml and add some tasks. First, we can delete this example task here as we won't be needing that anymore. Now I've got two things to do. I want to create a root directory for our website, and then I want to copy over the index.html file that I've just made into that directory, just as I did when I was configuring the server manually in the basics section. So first, I'll make a task called create web root. I'll use the module file for creating files and folders, and then we need some options. So path is of course the path to the folder, and as it's for serving web, that's going to be /var/www/, which is the default web folder for an Apache install. And now I'm going to add the domain variable here that we created earlier, so this will get subbed out for the domain name as the folder name. We're going to give it the state of directory, which means it will be a directory rather than a file. Just in case, I should say, directory and folder mean the same thing. I only mention this in case there are viewers from some parts of the world where one or the other term is preferred, but they mean the same thing and I use them interchangeably. Anyway, we're going to specify an owner of Ubuntu and a group of Ubuntu, and we'll give it the permissions 755. Any expert Apache admins amongst you may be shuddering at my use of Ubuntu for the web user here, rather than a specific user such as www-user or whatever else. But we don't need to worry too much about good practice for this demo. We're just taking the quickest possible route to joy so that we can see that our Ansible is working. Okay, now we've got some Ansible idempotently enforcing the existence of that directory, I'm going to make myself a task to copy in the index.html. So, the name is copy index.html to root. I'll use the trusty copy module. The source will be our index file in the repo at files/index.html, and the destination will be the newly created folder above, /var/www/domain variable, and then /index.html. As with the folder, let's give it an owner of Ubuntu, and we'll give it a group of Ubuntu, and a mode of 0755. Oh look, I've just noticed my mistake there. I missed the 0 from the start of my last permissions. You need to write them in that form in Ansible, which is known as octal, and is actually the full form. If, like me, you're just used to writing 755 on the command line, Linux is actually just adding that 0 automatically for you, but the technically correct way is to write octal like this, and Ansible will trip over itself if you don't. So far, we've got the web page itself copying over then. And of course, from earlier sections, Apache is already installed and the firewall already configured both on the VM if you're using Terraform and also in IP tables. So the next step now is to create the server-specific config required to make Ansible go and look for that web page. To that end, let's delete our example template here. And now let's create a new template called www.learnardtest.com.conf.j2. I've got pre-made config here that I nicked from the internet and also used in the basics section. It's easy to find config like this for virtual hosts, but just feel free to steal this from the Lernard GitHub page instead of writing it out if you want to, as it's really got nothing to do with Ansible. It's defining an Apache virtual host to serve our web page on port 80, and I've defined the server name and server alias to both be the domain variable to set them as our domain name. I've also added the path here as being the same as the directory we created in the task previously, so it's going to be looking at our index.html page when someone hits this on port 80. Now that we've created that template, let's jump back to tasks main.yml and put a new template task in to apply that to the correct place on the server. So, as before, we give it a name here. We write the word template to use the template module. We have the source as templates, And then let's be fancy and use our variable here for the file name rather than hard coding it. The destination in this case is etsy/apache2/sitesavailable. And again, we'll use our domain variable here, then .conf. And finally, I'll give it a mode of 0755 again, as we know that'll work and we're not too worried about tight security right now. That Etsy destination path is the same as the one we created in this during the basics section, and you don't need to particularly remember it. It's just the Apache default path for available sites. Once we've copied our config into sites available, we're now going to need to enable it, which is most easily done using the a2nsite command, which is short for Apache2 enable site. This is one of the few things that I haven't found an out-of-the-box module for that appeals to me, at least without downloading something special from someone else's GitHub. But that's no problem, as we can easily achieve this with the generic command module. So first, let's create a task with the name a2nsite, and then our domain variable. Come to think of it, in the interests of neatness, I might just go and variabilize that previous name as well. There we go. Right, now we want to use the module command, which is super useful and well worth remembering, as it's the module that allows us to run a bash command on a server. I'm going to write the command a2nsite, of course, and then again we can use our extremely useful domain variable here. Now we're going to use a little trick to make this a little bit more idempotent. When this command runs, it copies the config file from sites available, as we've told it to create above, into the folder called sites enabled, as this is what the a2nsite command essentially does. We can ask Ansible to check if that has already been done by writing args, then creates, then the path it will be creating the file in, like so. This isn't something you need to remember as a specific particularly. It's a bit niche to be considered a core concept as such, but it's a pretty handy trick if you can remember it, and Ansible is full of little tricks like this. People can and do spend a lifetime learning all the fine points of Ansible, and you can earn decent money for the foreseeable future just by knowing stuff like this in depth and applying them at a big firm. Right, last thing in this command then, once it's enabled our site, we're going to call that handler we made at the start of the section. We do this by writing notify, then choosing restart Apache2, which is the name that we gave to that handler. Ansible will know already to go and look in the handlers directory main.yml, so we don't need to explicitly specify where we created it. Last but not least, I want Apache to disable that default site that it starts off with that you may remember. So I'm just going to copy and paste this a2nsite thing here, and then change the details so that it's going to disable the default site instead of enabling ours. I've misspelled templates. I'll just quickly correct that. Don't worry if this is all seeming a bit complex to remember. It's not really about remembering all the detail here, so much as the feel of what we're up to. When you make stuff like this, you'll be crafting it out one error at a time, constantly doing failed runs and adding little bits and removing bits until it works. The process of messing around with a decent piece of Ansible or Terraform, getting the details wrong, and then grinding it out until it becomes right again is most definitely the path to becoming an awesome engineer. And in all honesty, I actually made a couple of mistakes recording this Ansible, but I just filmed it again to make it look like I was perfect. Okay, let's jump over to our terminal and give this a test flight. As always, I'll be using our Ansible-playbook command here. And there, we can see it's made some changes to our host. Let's see whether or not it's done what we expected now by opening up a Firefox window and simply browsing to the IP address of the web server. I'll just go and get the IP from hosts. There we go. Success! Just like the page says. it's serving our new page, which means by definition all the config and the files must be correct, because that's what we were trying to achieve. This is just so incredibly powerful compared to doing this manually. I don't know if any of you actually went through and tried to manually do the Apache config previously when you were going through basics, but it was dull and it was time consuming. And now we have Terraform and Ansible working in combination to create a fully configured web server with a web page on it in minutes. Imagine trying to do 1,000 of them by hand. It would take weeks, you'd need a whole team. But using Ansible and Terraform together, you can do any amount of machines in moments. And what's more, in a version controlled and idempotent way that's easy to change, revise and upgrade should we need to. So that's it for the Ansible chapter. The last section in this chapter is just going to be focused on a quick summary of what we've covered, plus a suggested list of extra reading and places you can go with your Ansible learning. This chapter, I reckon, should be enough to get you through any job interview for an Ansible role, if you practice all the stuff that you've learned so you can remember it and repeat it off by heart. But I have skated over a lot of subtlety that can be achieved. That being said, I think the best way to learn that kind of subtlety isn't really by watching a course which could go on for days and days, but by getting yourself that DevOps role where you can then sit there 8 hours a day on a fat salary and learn it for yourself. Right, the last thing we need to do then, as always, is behave like professional DevOps engineers and push our code back to GitHub. So, sing along if you know the words. CD back to the root of the repo, git status to check our changes, git add a, git commit -m with a sensible message, and then git push origin master. And with that, we've made it to the end of our Ansible chapter. If you've been following the course from the start, you now know how to configure a server using Terraform in the cloud with all the correct hardware settings, and on top of that, to use Ansible to give it all the correct internal operating system settings, to put the right programs on it that we need, and to provide them with configuration to run perfectly every time. Now we're going to take a look at Jenkins to build our code into reusable packages of software, and even more than that, to provide orchestration to bind together all we've got so far into a single unified pipeline. So, hopefully see you there.